Absolute value. So remember, you have to think back a little bit. Absolute value is defined. Absolute value is defined as a distance. It's the distance a number is from 0. Absolute value is the distance a number is from 0. Put your phone away, please. Now, lots of people say, like, oh, Mrs. Long, right, but, like, it's always positive. Well, it's not always positive, right? It depends on the problem. But, like, if you have a negative value, the absolute value of -5 is 5. And the absolute value of 5 is 5. It's the distance, it's the number of spaces it is from 0. Absolute value is a distance. It's the distance a number is from 0. So when we think about absolute value, for every absolute value solution, so if I find the absolute value and I find that the absolute value, the solution to an absolute value problem is 7, I need to be aware of that if the answer to the absolute value is 7, there are 2 possible problems. If I find the absolute value and I find that the absolute value turns out to be 7, the absolute value equals 7, I need to be aware of, I need to know that there were 2 original possibilities. To have an absolute value of 7, what are my 2 possibilities? Sean? 7 and -7. There are 2 beginnings. Right? There are 2 ways of finding that. So for example, the absolute value of 4 is 4, and the absolute value of -4 is 4. There are 2 ways of getting to that solution. There's the positive way of getting to that solution, and then there's a negative way of getting to that solution. There are 2 ways. So what we need to be aware of is that when we are solving absolute value equations, when solving absolute value equations, you must solve 2 equations. One positive and one negative. When you're solving an absolute value equation, you have to do it twice. There has to be 2 equations to solve. The first equation I'm going to solve for is the positive value, and the second one is the negative value, because a positive and a negative value, positive 7 and negative 7, both have the same outcome. They both have the same absolute value. When solving absolute value equations, you must solve 2 equations. We have to solve the positive version of it, and we have to solve the negative version of it. So let's start off really easy. The absolute value of x equals 10. This is my first algebraic, has a variable in it, absolute value problem. And I have to do 2 of them. I have to do x is equal to 10, because the absolute value of 10 is 10. And I have to do the negative version, because the absolute value of negative 10 is 10. So there are 2 solutions. There are 2 equations. And then we write our solutions like this. They're not parentheses. This is not an ordered pair. Those are brackets telling us that there are 2 possible outcomes that would get us the solution of 10. Let's try a little bit harder. The absolute value of 2x equals 30. So I've got an absolute value problem, correct? And I'm going to have to do it twice. I'm going to have to say, okay, 2x could equal 30 to give me an absolute value of 30. Or 2x could equal negative 30 to give me the absolute value of 30. So I have 2 possible answers. 2x could equal 30, or 2x could equal negative 30, because the absolute value of 30 equals 30, or the absolute value of negative 30 equals 30. I have to do it twice. Divide by 2, divide by 2. X equals 15, or x equals negative 15. I have 2 possible solutions, and I'm going to write it as negative 15 comma 15. I like to write my solutions least and then greatest. Both are going to be the same no matter how you write it, because it's not an ordered pair. They don't technically, right, have that stipulation on them. All right, so let's try a little bit harder. All right, so the absolute value of negative 5b plus 5. So the absolute value of negative 5b plus 5 equals 35. So I know that this piece right here, negative 5b plus 5, the solution to this piece right here should either equal positive 35 to give me an absolute value that is equal to 35, or this piece right here should equal negative 35, because the absolute value of negative 35 is equal to 35. So I'm going to solve it twice, one with a positive value, and I'm going to solve it the second time with a negative value. So I have to take my absolute value, because I know absolute value has 2 possibilities, a positive value and a negative value, and I have to solve for my variable. So I'm going to subtract 5. Negative 5b is equal to 30. Divide by negative 5. So b equals, what's my first possibility? Negative 6. Then over here, I'm going to do the same steps. I'm just going to get a different solution, because my possible answer in this one is the negative value, whereas this one was the positive value. So I get negative 40 divided by negative 5. What's my other option? B equals positive 8. So my solutions, I have 2 possible answers of negative 6 or positive 8. Sometimes when you're solving these, you need to isolate. What does it mean to isolate? Get it alone. Isolate the absolute value. And if you look at those examples that we did before this, the 3 examples, has the absolute value been all alone on one side of the equal sign? Is this just an absolute value is equal to a number? And then the other ones where an absolute value is by itself is equal to a number? Sometimes you won't have the absolute value by itself. You have to get it by itself. For example, the absolute value of 5a minus 6 minus 7 equals 49. So I have the absolute value of something minus 7 equals 49. Is the absolute value by itself? No, there's not. There's a minus 7 on the same side as the absolute value. So I have to isolate it first. So I'm going to add 7 to both sides. And now I'm left with the absolute value of 5a minus 6 equals what? 56. Now is the absolute value isolated? Yes. The absolute value is by itself. There's only an absolute value. So I can now solve it 2 times. 5a minus 6 needs to either be the positive value of 56 or 5a minus 6 needs to be the negative value of 56. Because if I have a positive 56 inside this absolute value, I'll get an answer of 56. Or if I have a negative 56 inside this absolute value, I'll get an answer of 56. So I'm going to add 6 to both sides. 5a equals 62. Divide by 5, divide by 5. A equals, what's 62 divided by 5? 12.4. I'd add 6 over here. 5a equals negative 50. Divide by 5, divide by 5. A equals negative 10. So my solution, 2 possible answers to this are negative 10 and 12.4. Most of the time, not all the time, but a lot of the time, you'll get a positive value